Welcome to Strength Physiology Online. My name is Dr. Grant Ralston, and what we're going to discuss today is understanding energy consumption, and this is in relationship to one of the modules that's available in one of the online courses, and that's obesity and diabetes. So what we're going to do is have an overview of energy consumption and understanding the eat well, play, etc., etc. So it used to be known as the Eat Well Plate, now it's referred to as the Eat Well Guide. So one of the first things to really think about is how does this differ to the Eat Well Plate and why was it reformatted? So when we start looking at it, dietary recommendations are always constantly under review as part of its role in maintaining the evidence base and promoting evidence-based public health. So in July 2014, PHE committed to review, and in light of that, they then drafted, this is what you see on the screen, and it's the conclusion of the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition's Carbohydrate and Health Report. When we look at this, you probably think that there's many similarities between the Eat Well Plate and the Eat Well Guide. However, when we look at it slightly more carefully, we can see some distinctive differences. Obviously, they renamed it the Eat Well Guide because what happened was research found that the approach of having a plate with a knife and fork no longer resonated with the public. What they actually did was they tested without key aspects depicting a plate and highlighted different features of the visual for consumers and concentrated their thinking as to the role of the depiction, namely that of diet, the guide to the overall diet. And as such, the Eat Well Guide was considered to be more helpful in terms of this. And what happened is they adopted the following, as you can see, based on consumer research. One of the other things they removed was the knife and fork. So this research highlighted that the knife and fork featured in the Eat Well Plate were no longer considered appealing aspects of the overall design. And it was felt that these added little to the meaning of the model and actually may cause further confusion when attempting to interpret the plate to be a recommendation for every mealtime. Another thing that they did do was draw images instead of using photographs of food. So within the testing of it, during the development of this guide, the research showed that those who are already engaged with food and nutrition tended to prefer photos, but those who were less engaged were more likely to have a poorer diet. And they actually preferred the drawing of these images. So in order to make the model accessible to the whole population, the drawn images were then embedded and then used, which tested well when we looked at consumer research. Another thing that they did do was they updated the segment names. So the names of the food group segments have been updated to place greater emphasis on certain food products within a food group that can be considered more environmentally sustainable. For example, the pink segment is named beans, pulses, fish, eggs, meat and other proteins to highlight the contribution non-meat sources make to the protein intake. Another thing they looked at as well is food group segments, and they resized it. So the segment sizes of the food groups have been adjusted to reflect current government advice on a healthy, more balanced diet. The revised segment sizes have been modelled using linear programming, and this modelling process took the current intakes of the most commonly consumed food in the United Kingdom, and this was actually according to the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. And what they did do is they applied the revised government dietary recommendations and modelled the fewest possible changes needed to achieve the proposed recommendations. And by using this method, it ensured that any adaptations made to the model were actually realistic and not too far removed from the current dietary habits of our population group, the UK population group. One thing you'll actually see it's new as well is the purple segment now contains oils and spreads. So the new Eat Well guide differentiates unsaturated oils, and these include vegetable or olive oils, and lower fat spreads from other foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar. And this is because some fat is essential in a healthy, balanced diet, but other foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar are not, and should be taken and eaten less often and in smaller portions or amounts. So the small size of the purple section also reflects the fact that oils and spreads are high fat and contain a lot of calories, so these should only be consumed in smaller amounts. So high fat, salt and sugar foods have been removed from this purple section. When we look at the foods high in fat and sugar, which previously featured in this purple section of the Eat Well plate, they have now been replaced outside of the main image. So consumer research again highlighted that the removal of these products from the main image aided consumer understanding of the role of the foods and drinks in the diet, and as products to be consumed infrequently and in smaller portions or amounts. It was also found that having these food products outside of this main image helped consumers to reflect the need to move their overall intakes towards a healthier lifestyle, whilst feeling that the Eat Well guide was an achievable target for their food consumption habits. Another one when we look at the top right is the inclusion of this hydration message. So keeping hydrated is essential for a healthy diet, and so the Eat Well guide reinforces this fluid recommendations and the best drinks to choose, namely water, low-fat milk, sugar-free drinks, and that also includes tea and coffee. So there was also additional messages for further guidance. This testing highlighted that most people found it helpful to have additional messaging on the guide, as this helped to answer some of the immediate questions raised when looking at the image alone. So consumer research tested several variations of support messaging to understand what phrasing was best understood by the consumers. And the wording that was found to offer the greatest impact in understanding was adopted for this final model that you can see. If we look up to the top left, what you see is an inclusion of energy requirements. So an orange border featuring the energy requirements for men and women has been used to reinforce the message that all food and drinks consumed contribute to total energy intake. This research revealed that the inclusion of an energy message provided adults with a useful benchmark for their own consumption. And again, we're talking about the top left, we're talking about the inclusion of a front of pack nutrition label. So a front of pack nutrition label has been added to the guide to respond to consumers' comments regarding the lack of guidance on choosing foods lower in fat, salt and sugar, especially when we're shopping, as there are several variations of the front of pack labels. What happened was an amalgamation of the most commonly used features of the front of pack nutrition label was used in the Eat Well guide, and this was to represent the information available on a variety of packaging foods. Lastly, when we look at the fruit juice has been removed from the fruit and veg segment. Although we know that fruit juice, when we're talking about 150 millilitres per day, still counts towards one of your 5 a day, the advice around drinks has been encompassed with the hydration measured of the new Eat Well guide. So when we're looking at the segments, which still stays the same, is eat at least 5 portions of a variety of fruit and vegetables of the day. When we're looking at the pink one, it's like eating some bean pulses, fish, meats, eggs and other proteins. Base meals based on potatoes, bread, pasta or other starchy carbohydrates. And lastly, when we're separating this plate or dividing this plate, have some dairy or dairy alternatives such as soya drinks and yogurts. Now what we're looking at is the adult recommendations as a percentage of total caloric intake. So the total number of calories a person needs each day varies depending on a number of factors. And this can actually include the person's age, gender, height, weight, and most importantly, the level of physical activity. Additionally, there's a need to lose, maintain, or gain weight, and other factors affect how many calories should be consumed on a day-to-day basis. The estimated amounts of calories needed to maintain calorie balance for various ages and sex groups at 3 different levels of physical activity. These estimates are based on the estimated energy requirements equation, and it uses reference heights. So our reference heights is making reference to the mean, and the reference weights of healthy people for each age, sex-related group. For children and adolescents, the reference height and weight varies and fluctuates. But for adults, the reference for a male is 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighs 70 kilos. So the reference for a female is 5 foot 4 inches tall and a weight of 57 kilos. So when we take these reference points into consideration, the estimated range should be between 1600 to 2400 calories per day for an adult female, and from between 2000 to 3000 calories per day for an adult male. But remember, this is based on a reference point of a male being 5 foot 10 at 70k and a female being 5 foot 4 at 57k. So within each age and sex category, the low end of the range is for sedentary individuals and the higher end of the range is for more active individuals. So due to reductions in basal metabolic rate that occur with aging, calorie needs generally decreases for adults as they get older. So estimated needs for young children range from 1000 to 2000 calories per day, and the range for older children and adolescents actually varies substantially from about 1400 calories to 3200 calories per day. And with boys, they generally need a higher calorific count than actually females. But the most important thing with this is these are only estimates and approximations of individual calorie needs, and it can be added with online tools that we can discuss later. But what we see here on the screen is recommended range statements. So we are looking at our food groups, we're looking at 50% of our total calorific intake should be of carbohydrates, but a smaller portion of those should only be from sugars. When we're looking at fats, we're talking about up to 35% of being fats, and we've just subdivided it down into saturates, polyunsaturates, trans fats, monounsaturated. And when we're looking at protein as well, based on a stereotypical reference point of view, you're looking about 15% of the total caloric intake should be from protein. So we've got a few things that we're going to have to discuss now. So what we did do is we talked about what roughly we should consume. Now we're going to look at this energy expenditure thing. So one thing we've got on the screen here is something referred to as resting metabolic rate, or RMR. And what this is an estimate of the amount of calories required to sustain an individual at rest for 24 hours or 1 day. We've got something else called BMR, or basal metabolic rate, and what that is, it's a measurement when the body is in a basal state, and that means comfortably at rest mentally and physiologically while being awake at room temperature and at least 14 hours after eating. So BMR is greater in males than in females, and is actually higher in the young and decreases as age advances. but there's multiple things that affect it and influence it, such as our body size, the state of our nutrition, and is slightly lower when we're sleeping. So it's important to note about this energy requirements of each individual. And this is all making reference to the actual amount of energy needed, and it varies from individual to individual, and it's actually dependent on the basal metabolic rate and how active we actually are. So the basal metabolic rate is the rate at which an individual uses energy to maintain basic cellular functioning of the body. And that includes breathing, trying to keep ourselves warm or regulate our temperature, and also ensuring that the heart is constantly beating, supplying oxygenated blood around the system. And this is all when we're completely at rest. An average adult will use approximately 1.1 kilocalorie each minute, just maintaining basic essential functioning, and the BMR differs from individual to individual, especially when we look within a population and also between population groups. When we take into consideration infants and young children, they have a greater tendency to have a proportionate higher BMR for the size due to rapid growth and development. In males, they usually have a higher BMR than females since they tend to have more muscles. And older adults usually have a lower BMR than the younger people since their muscle mass tends to decrease with age. So the BMR accounts on average for about 3/4 of an individual's energy needs. Now, importantly, we're needing to take into consideration our physical activity levels within a 24-hour cycle. So in addition to the BMR, individuals also use energy for movement of all physical types. The amount of energy an individual uses to perform daily tasks varies depending on factors including their height or their weight. So the heavier a person is, the more energy is required to necessitate that movement and their physical activity level. So an estimate of the amount of energy a person will need can be calculated by multiplying their BMR by a factor appropriate to the amount of activity that that person does. And that's known as the physical activity level, or PAL. So a PAL of 1.4 is associated with a very low level of physical activity at work or during leisure time. So this actually applies to a large proportion of the UK population, and this is actually in contrast to a PAL of 1.6 for females or 1.7 for males, because that actually represents moderate intensity activity. And with values of 1.8 for females or 1.9 for males representing high levels of physical activity. So when we see this equation here, energy expenditure equals BMR times PAL, this is us using this approach from published data. And what this does, it estimates the average energy requirement for different population groups. So, a regular supply of dietary energy is essential for life, as we know, and cellular functioning, and it's required to fuel all the different biological processes that occurs in the body. And these include keeping the heart beating, keeping all the organs functioning, maintaining our core body temperature, ensuring we get effective muscular contractions, as well as looking at cellular growth and development. However, daily energy requirements vary widely from person to person. As I've already said earlier, it included other factors such as sex, body size, body weight, climate, and physical activity levels. So when energy is obtained from the food and drink we consume, it's actually oxidization of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and alcohols. And what we do is we take these foods in, and what happens, we classify them as micronutrients or macronutrients. So it's almost like charging our phone. So the amount of energy that each of these macronutrients provides varies. For example, when we look at fat, it's the most energy dense nutrient and it provides 9 kilocalories, or approximately 37 kilojoules per gram. Protein provides 4 kilocalories, and that's about 17 kilojoules per gram. Most importantly, when we look at carbohydrates, such as starch and sugars, is the least energy dense nutrient, providing 3.75 kilocalories, or 16 kilojoules per gram, rounding it up to 4 calories. And a value of 4 calories is used for the food labelling processes. So application of these factors to the food and drink consumes enables energy intake to be estimated or evaluated. These days, energy intake is often measured in joules or kilojoules, but many people are still familiar with calories or kcal. So energy expenditure simply is the sum of the basal metabolic rate, that's the amount of energy expended while at rest at a neutral temperature and in a fasting state, the thermic effect of food, or TEF, otherwise known as the dietary-induced thermogenesis, and the energy expended in movement of all types. So a substantial portion of the total energy expenditure is accounted by the basal metabolic rate, which is determined principally by body mass and body consumption or composition, both of which vary with age and sex. So the thermic effect of food is the energy cost of breaking down and digesting the food, and it is actually rarely assessed separately. So we're going to talk about something referred to as metabolism, and that's converting food into energy. So metabolism is the process by which your body converts what you eat and drink into useful energy. So during this complex biochemical process, calories in food and beverages are combined with oxygen to release the energy your body needs to function. So even when we're at rest, our body actually needs energy for all the hidden features and functions, including breathing, circulating of the blood, the heart beating, the constant adjustment of our hormonal levels, and repairing and growing cells. So the number of calories the body uses to carry out basic functions is known again as this basal metabolic rate. So this basal metabolic rate, and this is what we may call metabolism. So there's several factors that determines individuals' basal metabolic rate. As I said, it includes our body size and composition, gender, and our age. So when we're looking at body size and composition, we know that people who are larger or have more muscle mass need to burn off more calories even when at rest. When we look at gender, males usually have less body fat and are more muscular than females of the same age and weight, which means men burn more calories than females. One thing when we start looking at our physiological age, not just our chronological age, but our physiological age, is as we get older, the amount of muscle tends to decrease and fat accounts for more of the weight, slowing down calorie burning, generally because of change of our physical activity levels. So energy needs for our body's basic functions stay fairly consistent and don't really fluctuate or change that much. In addition to the basal metabolic rate, two other factors determine how many calories our body burns each day. And these are food processing, or the digestion of food, and we call that thermogenesis, and physical activity. So food processing or thermogenesis is the digesting, absorbing, transporting and storing the food we consume, and that always takes and always requires us to break down the body and to break down calories. So about 10% of the calories from carbohydrates and proteins that we eat are used during the digestion or absorption of food and nutrients. When we're looking at physical activity and exercise, when we play sports such as football or walk to the shops, we play with the children or chase the dog or any other skeletal based movement, that accounts for the rest of the calories that we burn up each day. So physical activity is by far the most variable of the factors that determine how many calories we burn each day. We sort of speculate that the activity you do all day that isn't deliberate exercise, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So we call that NEAT. So the activities when it's not deliberate is deliberate exercise is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And this activity includes walking from room to room, doing the gardening, the housework, even rocking backwards and forwards in the chair. So NEAT accounts for about 100 to 800 calories that we use daily. When we look at metabolism and mass or weight, it may be tempting to blame everything on your metabolism for weight gain. But because metabolism is a natural process, our body has many mechanisms that regulate it to meet our individual needs. It's actually only in really rare occasions do you get excessive weight gain from medical problems that slows down the metabolism. And these include conditions such as Cushing's syndrome or having an underactive thyroid gland. And an underactive thyroid gland is hypothyroidism. So unfortunately, weight gain is a complicated process. It is a combination of genetic makeup, hormonal controls, dietary consumptions, the environmental setting of our lifestyle, and also our sleeping patterns, our physical activity levels, our physiological and our psychological stress levels. All of these elements and factors result in an imbalance in the energy balance equation. So you gain weight when you eat more calories than you burn, or fewer calories than you eat. So while it is true that some people seem to be able to lose weight more quickly and easily than others, someone loses weight when they burn up more calories than they consume. So to lose weight, we need to create an energy deficit by eating fewer calories or increasing the number of calories in which we burn through physical activity or a combination of both. When we look at physical activity, that should be an important component for our total daily energy expenditure. There's various modes and types of activity that contribute to our total physical activity profile. And all of these can form an integral part of our lifestyle. Total physical activity includes our work, our occupational activity, what we do in the household, such as our chores, the way we maybe have to look after somebody, such as our children, what we do within our leisure time, how we even get backwards and forwards to work based on our transport, and also our recreational sport and exercise. So physical activity can be further categorised in terms of the frequency in which we engage in it, how long or the duration, and how hard or the intensity of that given activity. At present, we've got a range of physical activity recommendations. So the physical activity levels in the UK are generally low, and it's actually a concern in virtually all sections of our adult population group, and alarmingly among older children and teenagers, and we've not even considered what effect that COVID lockdowns actually had on this. It's estimated that up to a third of boys and between a third and about 50% of girls are not sufficiently active. Again, this is before lockdown. Only 35% of males and 24% of females meet the physical activity recommendations laid down by the government. And the Department of Health recommends that in order to benefit health, we should undertake a minimum of 30 minutes of at least moderate intensity activity on 5 or more days a week. But the moderate intensity activity is defined as a level of activity that will lead to an increase in our breathing rate, an increase in our heart rate so you can start to feel your pulse, a feeling of increased warmth. You may be starting to perspire just slightly. And the interesting thing, this doesn't all have to be taken at once, this 30 minutes. It can be separated into 3 sections, such as 3 walks, 10 minutes and 10 minutes of duration. Its more benefit would be gained if the activity extends above the 30-minute guidelines. It's the minimum of 30 minutes of 5 or more days a week. These recommendations are also applying to older adults. In addition, older adults should aim to maintain greater range of mobility through daily activity, and this activity can then hopefully promote more balance, an improvement in strength and coordination. When we're looking at children and young people, it's recommended they engage in at least 60 minutes of at least moderate intensity exercise every day. And what we're looking to do there is increase their muscle strength and flexibility, as well as improving bone strength. So in order to prevent obesity, many individuals will need to participate or engage between 45 minutes and an hour of moderate intensity physical activity each day. And as I said before, this could be separated into smaller segments. So we've talked about the intake, we're talking about the expenditure. Now we're going to talk about how we measure energy. So when we look at food calorimetry, or how we measure calories in food. So people who check nutrition labels to make informed decisions about which food to eat and which to avoid often base these decisions solely on the number of calories per serving. So what is really a calorie? A calorie, like a joule, is a unit of energy. And when we're looking at the International System of Measurements, or units called SI, a unit for energy is this joule. However, the calorie is commonly used for a unit of food energy. So a calorie is equal to the amount of energy per unit mass required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So 1 calorie is the equivalent of 4.18 joules, or on the PowerPoint, 4.2 joules. So food calories, as read off a nutrition label, are actually kilocalories, and that's often denoted as calories with this capital C. And there are 1,000 calories in a kilocalorie or food calorie. So a calorimeter is a piece of equipment designed to measure the energy released or absorbed during a chemical reaction or phase change. So food calorimetry allows us to determine the number of calories per gram of food. So we're going to make reference to breaking down and building up. So when we look at something referred to as catabolism, it's catabolic reactions that break complex molecules, and that provides the energy needed by anabolic reactions to produce complex molecules. So catabolism is a process of transforming chemical fuels such as glucose into adenosine triphosphate. We use ATP, adenosine triphosphate, as energy. Anabolism, that's the process of cell differentiation and growth, or building up, and that requires energy as well in the form of ATP. Anabolism takes a few but basic raw materials and produces a wide variety of products such as peptides, proteins, polysaccharides, lipids, and nucleic acids. Catabolism and anabolism have separate metabolic pathways controlled by a distinctive set of hormones. So growth hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are anabolic hormones. Adrenaline, cortisol, glycagon are catabolic hormones. So glucose metabolism fluctuates when a person's circadian rhythm, which is regulated by anabolism and catabolism. Adrenaline, cortisol and glucagon are catabolic hormones, and glucose metabolism fluctuates when a person's circadian rhythm, which is regulated again via a process of anabolism and catabolism. So anabolic reactions require energy. The chemical reactions where ATP changes to adenosine diphosphate supplies energy for this metabolic process. Cells can combine anabolic reactions with catabolic reactions that release energy to form an efficient energy cycle. And the catabolic reactions transfer chemical fuels into cellular energy, which is then used to initiate the energy requiring anabolic reactions. ATP, a high energy molecule, couples anabolism by the release of free energy. And this energy doesn't come through the breakage of phosphate bonds, instead it is released from the hydration of the phosphate group. Anabolism is the opposite of catabolism. So if I use this example, synthesizing glucose or making glucose is an anabolic process, whereas the breaking down of glucose is a catabolic process. Anabolism requires the amount of energy described as an energy intake uphill process. Catabolism is a downhill process where energy is released as the organism uses up energy. Anabolism and catabolism must be regulated to avoid the two processes occurring simultaneously. Each process has its own set of hormones that switch these processes on and off. Anabolic hormones include these growth hormones, testosterone and estrogen, whereas catabolic hormones including adrenaline, cortisol and glycagon. And this balance between anabolism and catabolism is also regulated by our circadian rhythm, which processes such as glucose metabolism, and that fluctuates to match an animal's or a mammal's normal periods of activity throughout the day. So circadian rhythm is our biological clock. Anabolism can be viewed as a set of metabolic processes in which the synthesis of complex molecules is initiated by energy released through catabolism. And these complex molecules are produced through a systematic process from small and simple precursors. If I use this as an example, an anabolic reaction can begin with relatively simple precursor molecules and end with fairly complex products such as sugars, certain lipids, or even DNA, which has an extremely complex physical structure. So the increased complexity of the product of anabolic reactions also means that they are more energy rich than their simple precursors. Anabolic reactions constitute divergent processes, and that is relatively few types of raw materials are used to synthesize a wide variety of end products. And that results in an increase in cellular size, complexity, or both. Anabolic processes are responsible for cell differentiation and increases in body size. Bone mineralization and muscle mass are attributed to these processes. So anabolic processes produce peptides, proteins, polysaccharides, lipids, and nucleic acids. And these molecules comprise all the materials of living cells such as membranes, chromosomes, as well as specialised products of specific type of cells such as enzymes, antibodies, hormones, and even neurotransmitters. So when we look at this, we need energy to sustain cellular life, which then means we actually increase our life expectancy and we live. So absorptive state, when the stomach or gastrointestinal tract is full, we get something referred to as anabolism, and that exceeds catabolism, and that is an absorbed state. So an absorbed state is the period in which the gastrointestinal tract is full and the anabolic processes exceed catabolism. And the fuel used for this process is glucose. When we look at carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates based on this model are sent to the liver where they're converted to glucose. And the glucose then travels to the blood or is converted to glycogen and fats, call them triglycerides, for energy storage. The glycogen and fat will be stored in the liver and adipose tissue and reserves for the post-absorptive state. The remaining glucose is taken in for use by body cells or stored in the skeletal muscles, and they're stored as glycogen. When we look at these triglycerides, what happens is these lipoprotein particles that constitute the triglycerides, the phospholipids, cholesterol and proteins, these are the main products of fat digestion. And what happens is first broken down to fatty acids and glycerol through hydrolysis using lipoprotein lipase. This allows the triglycerides, the fats, to pass freely through the capillary walls. And most of this will be reconstituted as triglycerides and stored in adipose tissue. And the rest will be used for energy in adipose cells, skeletal muscles, as well as within the blood. In a low carbohydrate environment, other cells of the body will also begin to use triglycerides as an energy source. When we look at amino acids, the liver aminiates the amino acids to keto acids to be used in the Krebs cycle in order to regenerate or to generate energy in the form of ATP. They may also be converted to fat for energy storage. And some are used to make plasma proteins, but a large majority of them leave through liver or via the liver to be used by body cells to construct proteins. So the post-absorbed state occurs around 3 to 5 hours after we've consumed a meal and it's been completely digested and absorbed. When we look at this in a physiological context, fasting, this is referred to as fasting, and the metabolic status of a person who has not eaten overnight. The metabolic state achieved after complete digestion and absorption of a meal. So there's several metabolic adjustments that occur during fasting. And some diagnostic tests are used to determine a fasting state. So for example, an individual is assumed to be fasting after 8 to 12 hours. Metabolic changes towards the fasting state begin after absorption of a meal. So post-absorptive state is synonymous with this usage. And in contrast to the postprandial state of ongoing digestion. A diagnosis fast refers to prolonged fasting from 8 to 72 hours, and that's dependent on our age, conducted under supervision for investigation of a problem. And that's when we start to look at conditions such as hypoglycemia. So during fasting, post-absorptive state, fatty-free acid oxidation contributes proportionally more to energy expenditure than does carbohydrate oxidation. So this phenomenon is due largely to greater lipid and lower carbohydrate availability, as plasma non-esterified fatty acids concentration rises in response to lower insulin and higher counter-regulatory hormone concentration. So, two more slides to go through when we're just looking at rate of energy expenditure and oxygen consumption. When we engage in exercise, the muscles require oxygen for the production of energy. So all aerobic means is in the presence of oxygen. So an increase in exercise intensity increases the need for oxygen, and the volume of oxygen required is termed VO2. You may have heard of something called VO2 max, and that's the maximal consumption. So maximum oxygen consumption is termed or defined as VO2 max. And VO2 max is mostly accurately expressed as milliliters per kilo per minute. So something referred to EPOC, as you see here, as excessive post-oxygen consumption, is the amount of oxygen our body consumes following an exercise session that is above and beyond the pre-exercise oxygen consumption baseline. And our body uses more oxygen after exercise than before exercise, so we burn more calories during our recovery from exercise than we do before exercising. So why do we actually get an EPOC effect? So after exercise, our body has to return to its resting state, or as you know, homeostasis. Energy is used in the recovery process, which is why we experience an increase in calorific expenditure after exercise compared to before exercise. When we look at the academic work of Reynolds and Kravitz, they've stated that the following occurred during EPOC. There's a decrease in body temperature, replenishment of energy resources because we've depleted them, reoxygenation of blood and restoration of circulatory hormones, and a return to normal heart rate and breathing rate. So how long does EPOC actually last? Well, it's been sort of stated that the body can take between 15 minutes to 48 hours to fully recover from exercise. Research doesn't really agree on a specific time frame, and that's why they gave us ranges. But the majority of studies that's been reviewed that measured oxygen, maximum oxygen consumption within 24 hours after exercise. Previous research indicates that oxygen consumption and calorific expenditure may be elevated up to 24 hours post-exercise. So one of the burning questions we get an awful lot is as well, how many calories do we burn from EPOC? Researchers offer mixed results on the effect of EPOC after one bout of exercise because there's lots of factors that contribute to elevated caloric expenditure. And that can include the intensity and duration of exercise, the modality, the fitness level of the individual, the gender of it, the specific type of machine they're using, etc., etc. So additionally, variations in research designs and the methodology make it challenging to overcome and to bring it to a consensus about specifically how many calories we burn. Most research that's been reviewed shows that EPOC effect you can get an extra 50 to 200 calories after interval training and resistance training. But it may be worth to note that even more calories are expended during the actual exercise session. So the key takeaway points for that are EPOC seems to have a modest impact of total caloric expenditure. High intensity HIIT training, cardiorespiratory exercise, specific circuit training types, heavy load resistance training, Olympic lifting tend to have greatest effect on EPOC. So the types of exercise that elicit higher EPOC effects are looking at interval circuits and heavier resistance training because there's more physiological demand. And they're important to include in any training programs. So the last takeaway point, intake versus expenditure. In order for individuals to maintain their body weight, their energy intake must equal their energy expenditure. Failure to maintain energy balance will result in weight changes, as we can see in the slide. Energy balance can be maintained by regulating energy intake through diet, energy expenditure, and that means we're going to adjust our physical activity levels to match the intake, or a combination of both. Failure to compensate for an increase in energy intake with an increase in expenditure will result in positive energy balance or weight gain. A reduction in energy intake which isn't matched by a reduction in physical activity levels will result in weight loss or a negative energy balance. So there we have it, just a quick 30 minutes or so overview of understanding calorific or caloric consumption. So I hope you found this useful.